Yeah, I think it'd be a challenge, right? I think it's like, when I hear radically new, I hear PMA pathway, I hear no reimbursement, and both of those things, frankly, would scare me. We have invested in one PMA device, but it's part of the partner syndicate, and we more filled out the round. So it's possible for us. It's probably not our main model. Now, that's not to say I'm looking for incremental changes. I am looking for novel technology, but I prefer a 510K or 510K with clinicals pathway, and to have some way to qualify under existing reimbursement codes. And then I'm looking for novelty within that framework. But I'm not looking for taking it, changing the color of it, putting that on the market. If that makes sense.
Yeah, I mean, I think I spoke a little bit about this before. We generally do look for things that can make at least significant improvements. So something that is, if you come to us with something that is 20% better, cheaper, whatever, that's not really going to move the needle too much. So maybe the way that we define radical innovation or incredibly new might differ a little bit, but when it comes to performance advantages alone, even if it is a replacement product for something that does exist and there are reimbursement codes and whatnot already in place, we want to see a significant change in that, regardless of if the technology is somewhat similar, but we have a new enabling thing that makes it this much better, or if it's an entirely new approach to a verified market need. I think we're somewhat agnostic to that, but the main thing for us is we want to see the potential impact that will have, and then being able to understand how the ramifications of that and how you sort of get the value from that is useful and important to know. But I think maybe compared to some other funds, we are willing to take some technology risk. And because for us, I think it's usually not technologies that fail. We usually see failures with our own portfolio companies or companies in general more on the execution and market side of things. So I think where we stay away from really risky technologies and when we really have no clue what the end market will be and how that will look and how that will actually get adopted, I think that's really when it becomes a pretty significant challenge, and we need to have a lot of comfort around that, because sure, some technologies do fail, but generally that is very low on the list of why at least our companies don't succeed.
Yeah, I will give you analysis kind of in general, like how to think from a VC's perspective, how to choose from different type of company to invest. VC is always looking for company are better, faster, and cheaper. But how much better, how much cheaper, right? That's the difference. And one thing is important, no matter it's just a small upgrade or disruptive, is you need to have something unique in your product. If it's just a very simple, like 20% cost reduce for your product compared with the existing player, why do you think that existing player won't have a new generation do the similar thing? So you have to have something unique in your product, but not necessarily has to be totally disruptive. Because if you think from a fund perspective, that okay, for some devices already have a pathway, already have the 510K reimbursement code, you have some portion has a similarity, will make this device easier to get in reimbursement, but meanwhile have the unique pieces to make VC invest. So this type of the company will be much easier to get a market validation, but the potential exit potential may not be like multi-billion dollars. But on the other side, for some type of novel technology, disruptive technology, potential could be a huge thing, like a 0 or billion type of technology. But for a fund, they could not allocate all the capital into this moonshot company because there's a risk of losing the whole fund. So for example, typical VC fund, especially like my fund size is $100 million each fund, and lots of the early stage VC fund sizes range from $50 million to $100 million. So the typical structure would be like maybe 80% of capital allocated into the company have much lower risk, have something unique, that be able to have a very clear path for the exit, and 10 to 20% for the moonshot. So for you, you could decide whether you want to do a moonshot type of company, our innovation company with a certain type of unique upgrade. So that's how VC think about it.
I guess I'll talk out of both sides of my mouth here.
Because that's common for VCs.
Yeah,
It's okay, we're used to it.
So we have an investment that I would consider disruptive. It's more in the digital side, but that's what it's called Achille. It's a digital therapeutic using video game to treat ADHD. Completely kind of doesn't exist today. And then we have another investment in a company called Cardiva Medical, which is a vascular closure device, kind of incremental improvement, but data that it's better than the alternatives. Both are, I think, what I consider good. We have a lot of not so good investments. These are, I think, good investments. And so I think that you can have both in your fund. I think that disruption sounds good, it can be good, and I completely agree with you, where the disruption has to change the workflow. That's a really, really difficult thing to do because the market development challenges there are really hard. It's generally easier to take share than sort of build share or create a new market. So especially for small companies, take a little bit of share, you gain 1%, that's a lot of revenue for the small company. It's kind of less for the big incumbents. So there are investment cases for both. And I think, again, it kind of varies on the fund, what kind of risks they're willing to take. I would say that even within the disruptive category, there needs to be a burning platform. So there are some products out there that seem to fill an unmet need. And I'll give you an example of a type that is like, fill an unmet need. It seemed like a problem, the technology works, the data, meets all the things, but it may focus on clinician safety. And that just really doesn't, it adds additive to the system. So, something that protects from needle sticks or something like that. Important thing to do, but doesn't have the same kind of burning platform as something that may affect patient safety, where there may be reimbursement implications and other things. And yes, you could argue with clinician safety it's important because you don't want them to quit. So when you're disrupting, if you can be disrupting in an area that has a burning platform so that those market development challenges are less, I think there's a lot of great opportunity there, but there's nothing wrong with some of the incremental improvements as well. But there, at least what we look for, I think actually having PMA can be helpful because it can be incremental but new, because it means at least we know there's going to be a lot of data to differentiate it. And yes, it's sales and marketing expense and others, but at least there's a way to get on guidelines or other things to sort of manage that, both reimbursement risk, because guidelines help with reimbursement, but also the market development risk. I think you can do both.
I want to add more because I can tell some of you already start to get a little bit confused that even within this panel, you can see the diversity of different VC profile, different VC preference. That's also the reason why it's important for founder to do research on the investor. For the whole investor landscape, there are so many different types. We're like a VC, like typical institution investor, but there are also angel investor, investing early stage. There are also strategic investor are putting more capital into early stage. So how to structure the round? When is the best timing to talk to the right investor? It's important. If your product needs some investor have higher tolerance of the risk in the early stage, maybe angel investor is better. After you got some market validation, then institution investor could be a very good one to add to your board member. And when you talk to a strategic investor, they're not investing to a company only purely for financial return. They're looking for some strategic angle. Then are you okay to take that? Are you okay to align your goal with the strategic investor in such an early stage? Or you want to lift them to a later Series B round, C round? So that's the reason that founder need to study the investor landscape as well. And then you will find the right investor to work to and also make your life easier in the early stage.
So, thank you. So she was talking about diligence, and not the diligence that we do on you, but on what you need to do on us. And one of the things that I find that falls short very often is entrepreneurs, startups don't have the right advisors. They haven't talked to enough people before they approach the funds, whether it be the angel or anybody else. And I would encourage you just to talk to lots of people, get lots of information, and be able to kind of assimilate all that information and come up with a plan. I mean, there's certain, most of us probably know a lot of venture funds, and you tell us what you're doing, and we'll say, yeah, don't go to them, they will never do that. Or, we just know because this is our job. But I think that there could be better research with a lot of startups on who you're going to talk to and That's one. So, I mean, I just encourage you to talk to lots of people and get lots of information, because it's really kind of nice for us when someone really knows that there's a high chance we're interested in what you're doing. Not saying we'll invest, but at least it's a good fit. I've had 4 people come up to me today about biotech. Our website, the Resi brochure says device and diagnostics only, and they still pitch me biotech. Why? It tells me they didn't even read it. So if they're not going to have the courtesy to read it, why am I going to bother? You know, it should be that way. The other thing that I want to touch on that I heard here is the reimbursement part. You know, that is so important because, as she said, everything has to cost less, even if it's better. And so, you know what a DRG is, know what existing codes there are, do those codes qualify for what you're doing. Our fund will not invest if there's not a code, because it can take 3 to 7 years to get a code. So once you get through the FDA, because you can't get a code until you have FDA clearance, you're just going to pay $100,000 a month and burn, waiting for those 3 to 4 years to happen. You know, you can't do it. So know what's going on, and if you don't have a reimbursement code, you know, hopefully you'll figure out a good strategy for that before you pitch your investors, because again, nobody can predict the FDA, nobody can predict when you're going to get that code, and without reimbursement, you know, doctors want to get paid for what they do. Now, everything we invest in already has a code. It usually falls under a DRG because it's a hospital procedure, so who loses money? The hospital. Well, that's their problem. But if the doctor's not going to get paid for the procedure, they're not going to do that procedure, and that's just a fact of life.
I mean, reimbursement is, you know, another reason why the funding landscape, not to be pessimistic, but it's a reason why the funding landscape is challenging. You know, we as a firm do take on reimbursement risk, but it's important that there's, you know, some thoughtfulness behind this reimbursement strategy, and it can change over time, certainly. And there are different ways to get paid, and so so certainly the inpatient devices that are used in the inpatient setting where it's going to fall under DRG, you have to make a real health economic cost argument. And so some of those resonate and some don't, right? It kind of gets to, is there a burning platform? Is it how much of it are kind of direct costs, you know, versus indirect? And usually the biggest driver is like a reduced length of stay, which is very viable, but it's a little harder to quantify. So you really having data that shows that the length of stay is reduced can be very useful to really make the argument. And as we think, again, we think about little bit later stage, right? So we're in a different boat a bit, but for us, that dovetails with the commercial strategy. And so much of it is understanding that there's kind of the C-suite sale, and then there's the C-suite sale and the clinician sale. You need a clinical stakeholder, but you often then need to involve folks at the hospital level, because the cost or the benefits may accrue outside of the individual department that's buying the device. And so kind of the reimbursement strategy, the health economics, and the commercial strategy, it doesn't have to all be figured out, but there should be some thoughtfulness behind it that seems like if we put capital behind it, can scale and start to drive real adoption.
Does everybody know what the value analysis committee is in a hospital? Does anybody not know? So if you want to bring new technology in the hospital, it's got to go through the VAC. And the VAC is made up of hospital staff and some doctors. And let's say the hospital has 3 different types of total hip replacements, and you just invented a new great one, and your data shows it's just as good as the other ones. It'll never get in the hospital. We already got 3, we don't need a 4th. And these are everything that people need to understand, because unless you have a much better device, faster, less expensive, better outcomes, that you can prove with a paper, it won't get through the VAC. And as if
and that may not be enough, that may not be enough, right? It's actually having the advocates as well, and actually understanding the politics of the institution, which can make for a challenging investment, because every institution is different. And so to say, oh, they figured it out because they got it in 2 hospitals, doesn't always work. So but it's understanding, oh, we figured out, that we need, that maybe there's certain archetypes of hospital types, and we figured out the strategy to go after sort of the leadership, the right stakeholders in the given hospitals, and it goes. I think you absolutely need all of the data but you also, it's about understanding how to navigate the politics. Everything's different, and every product type is different. I mean,
Yeah, I left out the physician champion. Without that, he's correct. Everything I said still won't work. If you don't have your physician champion, and then why is he going to expend his political or his or her political capital on your device? Because, if he goes to the mat for you once, he probably used it up for a while. And I mean, so your jobs are hard, but believe it, our jobs are hard too, because we have to put all this into a huge equation and determine, do we take this risk or not in investing? And I can tell you, the hospitals have made it so tough. It's just really difficult. We have a few minutes left, so any more questions? All right, anybody else have any more comments? I thought this was pretty good.
I have a question. Hi, sorry. What do you think about medical devices that are not necessarily developed specifically for hospitals, but perhaps for larger international organizations, like the World Health Organization? Is that something that you would invest in?
Us specifically?
Well, just saying in general.
Who wants to take that?
Are specific institutions really, I guess the way to put it is, devices that may be utilized in a more exotic context, or a more provocative context?
I mean,
Go ahead.
so for us specifically, it's probably not a good fit. Our real bread and butter is selling to the hospital space in the U.S. The further you get away from that, the less comfortable we get. That being said, there are tons of people that will fund that. For instance, the Acumen Fund or whatever. So there are people that are, for this type of business that's appropriate for, but it's not us.
For us, we would at least consider it. We don't necessarily restrict ourselves only to companies focused on the U.S. healthcare system. So it is a possibility, and we do track some impact type metrics. So most of our impact metrics are not really in the health space. It's more around CO2 reduction and water use reductions and things like that are kind of unrelated for this panel, because we invest more than in just the healthcare space. But yeah, one thing that I would certainly encourage you to do if you have a company in that space is to perhaps think even just a little bit outside of the traditional med tech, medical device investors, and think about, there's a lot of impact funds, especially over the last couple of years. There's been more and more funds trying to align themselves with impact kinds of goals, and people define them in very, very different ways. Some focused on, third world areas, or some on improving health outcomes and quality of life. So it could be sometimes worth a different lens, or trying to cast a wider net than the traditional VCs focused on the health space. So that's my kind of thoughts on it.
At least for my firm, we're not against the West global perspective at all. We actually encourage founders to have a global perspective, especially thinking about healthcare innovation. But you have to focus on one market to start with. For example, United States have a pretty mature healthcare system, and also very relatively easier. I won't say very easy, relatively easier for founder to get started because it's all regulated quite well. And I totally agree with Matthew that there's also the impact fund being raised for the past few years. So question to you is, who you choose to pitch to? If you're pitched to a traditional healthcare VC, and the metrics we're looking at, like what is the focus, technology, unique differentiation, and also exit. But if you're pitching to an impact fund, they may value other impact metrics as well. And I do strongly suggest, no matter it's a for-profit or non-for-profit impact project, always try to have a very good sustainable business model to make money, have a pretty big potential market, then could support a company in the long term, no matter you're thinking about building up as a traditional healthcare company or impact company.
I don't have much to add beyond what they've said. I think the only point I was going to add was a different issue that reminded me, and came up around sort of how do you sort of get the attention if you in the med tech space of that. And I think, and it gets to this point, if there's lots of different kind of investors out there, I think there's, in having the right strategic advisors, there's something to be said about having some level of validation. So for us, right, it's like commercial traction is like market validation is important. but also, who's the investor base? And you gotta get your first investors at some, maybe, hopefully you don't, right? You can self-fund forever and, make lots of money and never need to take outside capital. But assuming you do, you have to get that first investment at some point. And it can be hard because it's kind of a catch-22. You don't have it, you don't have institutional money or this or that, so they give it to you. But looking for alternative sources, and I listened to a panel this morning with the health system partners, having hospital VCs who actually really like med devices because they're used in their hospital, they can test it out. So they're potential customers, so it kind of validates it in that regard, because no hospital VC is going to invest unless they've talked to the clinicians about it. And they're probably not potential acquirers, but they can sort of help with a podium strategy or other things to get adoption. And then obviously strategic investors may be potential acquirers and can be supportive for clinical development and maybe eventually and marketing partnerships. And they may not lead the investment, but if you can get one of them on board early, it actually is a great signal to the kind of more traditional VC firms or growth equity firms. And they have high bars, but they're sort of what they're looking for is it can be a bit different. And so it's certainly wouldn't pass up money from those sources because I think it provides a lot of strategic benefit.
Yeah, I want to add on that. I totally agree with Adam that even we're looking for early stage investment, if I saw this wrong, you have a good player venture like Kaiser Venture, a good strategic investor could be potential buyer joining the round. It's a positive signal. But on the other side is how founder handle that. To be honest, I do not prefer to see the founder give the board seat to any non-institutional investor before Series B round. Because as I mentioned earlier, the strategic alignment might be different. And the investor in early stage, we very well align with the interests of the company and the founder, but strategic investor might be different. So whether give them a board seat is a very important question to ask yourself. And another thing is, even gather money in, there's so different type of way to gather money in. You could do an equity round with institutional investor and do a note round with strategic investor. They're still your investor who got enough capital, but meanwhile, they're not officially become your shareholder until next round. And also meanwhile, their big chunk of capital won't really impact your valuation in the early stage. So just quick feedback.
So hey, thank you everybody for coming. We're out of time. Have a good rest of your conference.